my channel. This is the third part, the last part, hopefully, of our building out the feature for forums where forum admins can enable or disable Google ReCAPTCHA during email signup. And for this video, we are going to be working on the UX feature, which hides the fields for the site key and the secret key for the Google ReCAPTCHA. If the option is disabled, those fields are hidden, and if it's enabled, then the fields show. And then we are going to write Rspec tests for all the functionality that we built as part of this implementation. All right, now, but before any of those two, I do want to do a little bit of refactoring, and I forgot this in the second video, so let me go ahead and get it out the way. So this is the code for our email registration form, if you remember, and we have this pretty beefy, pretty large check. Now this is a view. For the most part, Rails convention and kind of like the way we do things, views are just for rendering. We kind of don't want to have too much logic happening in the view, you know, too many calculations. We just want to keep it strictly we're displaying information to the user. And so this is actually pretty beefy, pretty heavy to be in a view. So we are going to extract this out into a helper method. All right. So let's go ahead and copy this. Now I'm thinking, where is this going to live, right? We are in authentication land. Well, let's go ahead and see what we have available to us in the helper arena. So we have helpers here, and that's under main app. But let's go to, okay, helpers. And there's no admin, you know, like there's no admin folder, you know, like a namespace, right? So we just have a bunch of helper files over here. So what makes sense? Authentication helper. Well, we have been working on authentication features, so let's go ahead and see what we have in here. And we have, well, this makes sense. We have authentication provider, authentication available providers. If you remember in our show, we do have a section where the forum admin can select the types of third-party authentication methods that can be available right here. Okay, right here. And so this file makes sense to create our helper method. All right, so let's go ahead and just say def end, and I'm thinking about what we're gonna call it. Let me go ahead and paste the information in there first anyway. And so what do we want to call this helper method? It pays to think about, you know, names of methods or modules, or because you really want to communicate the purpose for something. And so here we are making sure that the keys are present, and we're making sure that the option is enabled in the configuration section. So it makes sense to call this ReCAPTCHA configured. So the configured part is the keys are present and enabled. And that part is the checkbox is actually checked that yes, require ReCAPTCHA during email sign up. So that method name makes sense to me, that helper name. All right, so, and we're gonna put a question mark because it's basically something that we're asking. And so ReCAPTCHA configured and enabled, and that's the name of our helper method. So let's save that, and instead of all this in here, we are just gonna throw that in there. Beautiful. All right, so that was a little bit of refactoring for that, and we're gonna write tests later, and so we'll test that definitely in our Rspec tests. So no need to test it on the front end. All right. The second thing that we are going to do, so that's done. The second thing that we're going to do is we are going to, like I said, set things so that when, yeah, these are our keys. Okay, so set things so that when this is checked, these the fields show, and when it's not checked, they don't show. All right, so I went ahead and checked for, and that's JavaScript basically, right? So I went ahead and checked for whether we have any JavaScript file that is associated with this view, and I didn't find any. And the reason I'm doing that, I'm not trying to be sneaky. I'm thinking about the time, the duration of the video, and so some things I go ahead and check before I record. But I went ahead and checked for some kind of JavaScript file. So this is the JavaScript folder, this is the admin namespace, and I didn't really see any except for this, these controllers here. And from previous experience, I know that this is Stimulus.js, right? And Stimulus.js, I'm gonna link it down in the description below. It's just a wonderful way to create sort of like JavaScript controllers, and allows you to hook up actions in your application in very seamless ways. And it's a very lightweight utility. So I'll link it down in the description below and you can check it out. And so I lost my mouse there for a second. All right. And so I have this config controller. All right. Again, config, because we're in the configuration space, right? So let's check it out and see what's going on. All right. So we have, okay, we have some targets defined, and we have this one function. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to search for it in our show page and kind of see where it's being used. Okay, so it's being used right here where it looks like this is a checkbox. Good, because we have a checkbox as well. And it looks like this is the invite only mode checkbox. And it looks like if that is checked, then there's some action. Okay, that action is being called. And there's also a target defined on this checkbox as well. This looks like it may just suit our needs just great. It looks like it to me. All right. So let's go ahead and start implementation. So we have, so this is a function that we're going to define, but we also have a target. Okay, so let's go down to our checkbox, which is right here. And these are our fields. Well, okay, we have this ID. All right. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this attribute right here before the class, and I'm going to put it here. So right after, okay, before the class. Great. Now, of course, I have to change it up to suit. Let's rename the target, and we're going to call it ReCAPTCHA email sign up. Okay, and then we're going to create some function, and I think what we are trying to do with this is we're trying to toggle show and hide the fields, right, on click. And so let's call this toggle ReCAPTCHA fields, right? Okay, that makes sense. All right, so we have that set up. Now let's go into the config controller. So this was a target, so we're going to need to add that. If you remember, we have this array, right, that's defining the targets, and so we need to add a third target, which is ours. And then we have, so this isn't our function, so we have our own function name. Let's go ahead and grab that, and we're going to define it down here. All right, and let's see, so what is this function doing? So what we want to, and similar to kind of what we have here, like you see if it's checking if the target is checked, right? And so we're going to do the same thing, right? So we're going to say if this dot reCAPTCHA email sign up target. So if you notice here, the target, the invite only mode is, invite only mode here, but down here you add target, right? So I may not be like an expert in Stimulus.js, but I'm following an existing implementation, and I'm using it, I'm repurposing it for my, what I'm trying to do, right? And so, this way it's helped me to level up as an early career dev, because it's literally standing on the shoulders of giants. In this case, you're standing on the shoulders of previous implementation, right? Okay, so we're going to say reCAPTCHA email sign up target, and we want to see if it's checked, right? So if it's checked, and let's just pseudocode it. If it's checked, we want to show the fields, right? Else, if it's not checked, we want to hide the fields. Okay, so we need to grab the fields, right? We need to query the fields and then add what we need. Now, if we go back to our show page, if you remember when we configured the reCAPTCHA during email, we set the default equal to true, right? And so because it's by default, the reCAPTCHA is required during email sign up, that means when we first go to the admin config section, we should see the fields, right? Okay, so now we want to think about when it's unchecked, we want the fields to be hidden. And so how do we hide the fields? That's the question I'm heading. And if you remember, there was a class on here called collapse, right? And so if we come to the authentication section in the config, you see I added that class collapse and we don't see the fields. Now if I come and take it out and we reload the page, we should see the fields. There they are. Okay, so that's what we're targeting, right? In our config controller, that's what we are. So we're basically, if it's checked, then we're not going to have the collapse class. But if it is unchecked, then we're going to add the collapse class, right? Okay, so this is the ID for our container. So we're going to grab that because we need that for the query. And so if it is checked, then we want to query document query selector, and it's an ID. All right, so we query for this, and then we want to remove the collapse class. Okay, if it's checked, we don't want it there. Else, it's the same thing. Okay, we want to add the collapse class. All right, and I think that's it. Okay, and this is good. All right, so let's see how it works. All right, let me reduce the size of my head just a little bit. Oh, I guess it's okay. All right, so so right now we see the fields, and if I uncheck, the fields are hidden, and if I check, the fields show. All right, so it's working. But one thing we have to keep in mind is when we first came to this section, the option was enabled, right? The reCAPTCHA option was enabled, and we saw the keys. What if it was disabled? Okay, so what if this option was disabled? So let's actually go ahead and disable it and save it, right? Okay, So I've gone ahead and I've disabled the reCAPTCHA option. But when we open toggle, we see the keys, right? Now, why is that? Why is that? Because if you notice, if I go ahead and enable and then see, enable, disable, now it's hiding and showing. But when we first came to the config section, we know that we have disabled reCAPTCHA, but the keys are showing. And the reason for that is because in the actual code, on initial load, we don't have that collapse. Okay, we don't have that collapse class added, right? On initial load. And so we need to, in this class and in the ERB file, because this is Rails, Ruby Rails, we need to add a check. We need to check this setting. The site config require reCAPTCHA during email sign up. We need to check the current state of it. And based on the current state, we're going to either add the collapse class on initial load or not. Okay, and this is how that's going to work. So we are going to we're going to put some Ruby code in here, and we're going to use a ternary. So we're going to include a check. We're checking if this is true, then if it's checked, then we don't want anything. Else, if it's not checked, then we want, that is, if it's not enabled, then we want the collapse class to be added. Okay, now that's card body. I just have to be sure about my syntax. Just make sure it's correct. Okay. All right. Well, let's see if it works. I'm not sure about the syntax. All right. So let's see. Well, it didn't blow up the application. That's good. Great. It did work. Okay. And so because this is disabled, right, in the database, this check didn't come, this is false. So because this is false, it's added the collapse class, right? If this were true, and we're going to go and set it, if this were true, then it would be blank, nothing would have been added to the classes of that div, right? So, and we can actually go ahead and so let's go ahead and enable it and save. All right, so we've updated, and if we toggle, we see that it's enabled in the database and we see the fields. All right, so we have implemented that UX, that better user experience, right, for this. Now we're going to go into the tests, and we're going to leave that open. All right, so let's go into our files, and we are going to think about where our tests are going to live. One thing that I found working with Forem is I very, very rarely need to create a completely new test file. Chances are there is a test file somewhere that covers the area where you implemented what you did, and so you just need to stick your particular tests in there. So let's go ahead and go over to, no, sorry, not app. Let's go over to spec, okay, our spec folder, and we are going to, you know what, there's an easier way to do this. Remember how we use the allow email password registration as a kind of guide for setting up the ReCAPTCHA? We can actually just search that and see what spec files it touches, right? So let's collapse all of those. Okay, so we see here registration spec and user logs in with email spec. Well, that's logs in, and we were dealing with registration. So I don't think we're going to need that file. But you know what? It doesn't hurt to open it. Okay, and we have our registration spec. Okay, all right. And then thinking through some other things, remember we had the help controller, the authentication helper. We had this helper, okay? And so I'm going to search authentication helper, because typically helper methods have specs. And so I'm going to search that and see if there are any associated spec files, and there is. And so we're going to open that as well. We need that because we need to test the helper method that we created. That's all I can think of off the top of my head right now. So let's start with that. And if there's any more spec files that we need to touch, we'll go ahead and touch them. All right. Let me move my head over here. And so let's go into our registration spec. All right. It's quite robust. Okay. But let's go in. So this is, we are describing when not logged in. Okay. It only shows the single okay when email login is enabled. Okay. And when login, all right. Okay, so that's like the first block, the login describe block. Okay. Okay, so here we have a describe create account. Okay, so when email registration is allowed. Okay, so that meshes with what we did, right? So email registration is allowed. Okay, and it shows the sign-in page. Okay, and it shows the sign-in text. Oh, okay. So that is not the sign up page, but that page where it says you click that button, sign up. Okay, so that's not us. Okay, and when email is not allowed. Okay, and then when the user is logged in. Okay, so our test needs to go in somewhere here. All right, somewhere here, and they are testing another like state, like where the params has another state, but we have the email sign up state. Okay, so let's add our test here. Okay, so the first context that we're going to test is when email registration is allowed and the reCAPTCHA is required. All right, okay, so context when email registration, oh, I made a mistake right here. Okay, so when email registration, and I'm just going to set up the block, and then we're going to have a couple of before do's, and then we are going to have our assertions. Okay, I'm just setting up like the scaffolding. Okay, so the context is when email registration is allowed and reCAPTCHA is required. All right, now before we run the test, we want to make sure that those attributes for site config, those fields are what we need them to be. So we're going to allow site config to receive, and that's the method. I'm just going to copy and paste from my little I'm not going to say cheat sheet, but more like reminder sheet, right? So allow this model to receive this call and return true, right? And returns underscore and what's going on, and return true. All right, and so we're basically making sure that email registration is allowed, right? And then we're also going to make sure that reCAPTCHA is enabled. So we're going to do that as well. Okay, and it's going to receive, I forget what it was. I always have to copy require reCAPTCHA during email sign up. Okay. Where is my spec? Okay. Okay, allow email, all right. And so I change this to this, and that also returns true, all right? So those two things are going to run before our tests, right? Now in the assertion, we're expecting to see the reCAPTCHA box. So display reCAPTCHA box on email sign up page. That's what we're expecting to see, right? And so within the assertion now, we're going to send a get request to the sign up page with the particular parameter that we need. Okay, so we're going to get the sign up, and that's the same thing you kind of have going up here. In fact, I can just go ahead and grab it. Okay, so it's the same thing we have going up there, but our state is different. Our state is going to be email sign up, I believe. And I believe it's an underscore. Is it an underscore? I don't remember. I believe so. Let's see. Do we have incog? No, we don't. Okay. Let's open an incognito. Just verify. Localhost, create an account, sign up with email. Yes, the state is underscore sign up. All right. So we're correct there. All right. So we get that, and then we have our expectation, and we are expecting the response body, which is the body of the page loaded. We expect it to include, and let's think about if we go back to our email registration form, and this is the box ReCAPTCHA. I think it makes sense to check for this class. No? Because everything else is under the hood of the ReCAPTCHA gem, right? But I think if we check for that class, that kind of makes sense. So we expect it to include this class, all right? And let's get rid of the extra spaces there. All right, so that makes sense to me, you know, at least on the front end. Okay, we're making sure that we see that. So let's go ahead and run the test and see if it passes. So this is spec request registration spec line 9. All right, so I figured out that for some reason we need to run bundle exec before the Rspec, but that wasn't the case yesterday. Anyway, that's all right. We'll go ahead and do what it requires. And so registration spec, and I just want to run the spec on line 91, and hopefully it should work this time. And we are hoping for a pass, and it passed, and that is wonderful. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, all right, so that spec passed. All right, and so let's go ahead now, and we're going to go down to the post section, the describe post, and this is actually where we're testing the creation of the actual user account, right? Okay, and so we have here this one context. This is another context. It's configured to accept. Okay, good. So this is our context right here. It's configured to accept email registration. So it looks like our test is going to live in here. And I'm just looking over here at my, okay. Now, the first thing, so this is testing now the actual the actual REST call, the API call, which is the post, right? And in order to test our ReCAPTCHA, we need a way to mock the completion of the ReCAPTCHA, right? We need a way to mock that. Now, if we remember, we repurposed the ReCAPTCHA stuff from the feedback messages implementation. And so I'm going to go and look for the feedback messages spec and see how it's done there, right? That's like my first line of attack, so to speak. So let's go into spec, and we are looking for, let's see if there's anything in requests, right? We don't see. Okay, we're looking for, here we go, feedback messages spec. Wonderful. So let's go ahead and look and kind of see how they did things here. Okay, all right. Now, right at the top, I see maybe what I'm looking for. I see a function called mock ReCAPTCHA verification, right? And so we're mocking the verification of the ReCAPTCHA, and it looks like it's allowing any instance of feedback messages controller. We have a controller, ours is registrations, and allowing any instance of that to receive this and return true. I'm just going to copy this. I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to go over to my spec file, and right underneath the describe, just like they did in that spec, I'm going to paste that right there. Okay, and so, and then I need to modify, because we're not using that controller, we're using the registrations controller. All right, so that looks like it's going to give us a way to mock completion of the recap. Like, I'm just going to create my own context. I'm not going to hijack this one because it might get messy. So let's go ahead and create our own context, and I have it here, and I'm just going to copy. You can't see this, but I will walk us, because typing is going to take forever. So I will walk us through the entire thing after I have it on here. So I'm going to put my new context here, right? Okay, so this context I'm going to walk us through is when the site is configured for email sign up and it requires ReCAPTCHA. Okay, so we've talked about, we've tested the appearance of the ReCAPTCHA box on the page. Now we have ReCAPTCHA enabled, and we're testing the user sign up, and then we're going to test the different scenarios when it comes to the ReCAPTCHA, right? And so in our before do, we make sure email registration is true. We make sure that the ReCAPTCHA is required. So this is our first assertion. So we have, it creates a user when valid params are passed. Remember, in the user sign up form, and the ReCAPTCHA is completed. And this is where we are calling that function that we created, the mock ReCAPTCHA verification. We're calling it here. All right, and then we are sending a post request to the user's endpoint, and these are the parameters, and they're just kind of name, username, email, password, and the passwords are the same. So these are valid parameters. The expectation is we are expecting there to be one user created, and so this is a test suite, and so no users exist, but after we run this test, we are expecting there to be one user, which shows that the user was created. Okay, so that's that assertion. And then down here we do not want the user created if the params are valid but the ReCAPTCHA was incomplete. Okay, and so in this test you don't see this. We're not including the mock ReCAPTCHA verification over here because we don't want to complete the ReCAPTCHA, but we make sure that all the parameters for the fields are valid, right? Now these are our expectations. We are expecting there to be no users, and so the user count is 0. We are expecting the response to be a redirect to our email sign up page, all right, which is what we saw on the front end when we tested it. And so this is what we're expecting. Then we have this command called follow redirect. And so we are asking our test to follow the redirect, follow to the page that we're being redirected to. And once we get there, we are expecting the response body. This is old, so we're going to change that. And we need to grab that from our registrations controller. So let's go ahead and grab that because we need to update it. Registrations, here it is. Okay, and we need to grab whatever the flash message is. We need to grab that for our purposes, for our spec. Okay, and we plug that in there. Okay, and so this is basically testing the two scenarios where the reCAPTCHA is completed and it's not completed. All right, so let's run this file, and this is line 178. So let's go back here and let's run 178, and we are expecting them to pass. Okay, we have some errors. This was my prior. I see the mistake. I need it to be, let's go to our show page. Yes, I didn't call it the right thing. Yeah, because that was from my prior implementation. So that's why it's not finding what it's expecting to find. This is wrong. Okay, all right, my mistake. So let's go ahead and run it again, and we should have tests to pass. And after this, we have just one more spec to write, and that is the spec to test our new helper method that we created, right? And we have passing tests. Wonderful. All right, so let's go back into the code, and let's go into our authentication helper spec, right? And if you remember that helper that we wrote, we need to write a spec for it. And just to save time, I have the spec right here, and I'm going to walk us through it. Okay, so we have, because it was a different function that we wrote, or a different helper, and so this is describing the ReCAPTCHA configured and enabled helper, and the context is this is when ReCAPTCHA is enabled. All right, so it's enabled in the configuration section, and that is the context that we're testing first. And so before we are allowing, and we need to switch that again from previous implementation. And so we are making sure that we return true for the ReCAPTCHA being enabled. And so we're testing, it should return true if both the keys are present. And so we are making sure that we are receiving some key back, right? Like that's what counts. Something is populating the field. And so that's what these two sentences are saying. And we are expecting this helper to be true, to return true. And then we are saying the assertion is it will return false if the site or the secret key is missing. And so, you know, right here we're letting the site key be missing. Let's add, I didn't do this the first implementation, but let's return something for the secret key. And so we have something in the secret key, but we don't have anything in the site key, right? And we're expecting it to be false. Okay, and then here we are expecting the ReCAPTCHA, we are expecting the helper to return false if the ReCAPTCHA is disabled. And so we are, in this assertion, we are returning false, meaning the ReCAPTCHA is disabled. And let's go ahead and set the keys. I think that's a more robust test, right? And so we have the ReCAPTCHA set to disabled, but we are returning something for both keys. And we're still expecting the helper method to return false, right? So that's our test. This is line 31, and spec helpers, authentication helper. So let's go ahead and run this. So we're gonna say bundle exec Rspec. We're just at the finish line. Spec helpers, authentication helper, and it was what line? Line 31. Okay. And so we are expecting all those tests to pass, after which we will be done with this project. Wonderful. All 3 tests pass. Thank you so much for bearing with me through these 3 videos. And so just to recap, we implemented this feature allowing forum admins to enable or disable ReCAPTCHA. We actually hooked up the ReCAPTCHA confirmation to the user account creation action, and making sure that if the ReCAPTCHA wasn't completed, then the user account wasn't created. We also did a bit of UX development where we hid the key fields if the option for ReCAPTCHA was disabled, and if it was enabled, we showed the fields. And lastly, we wrote some pretty robust tests to test all the new functionality that we created. Thank you so much for walking with me through this process. I hope it was helpful. I hope my hope is that as you see the way I'm doing this, and I always say as an early career dev, I've not been a dev even up to 2 years, but I hope that I've inspired and encouraged you to kind of, shake off the nerves and get out of your head and just start coding, start working on whatever it is you're working, and fix the errors as they come up and stand on the shoulders of previous implementation. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.